next up, we've got one of our major speakers here on the rally today. It's Mr. Bernard Gaynor, retired major in our forces, 20 years intelligence for Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, I mean, you know, what can you say to that? Studied and speaks Arabic. So for all the left-wing media, no one knows what it's about and you're all guessing and, you know, you've heard it over the back fence and you don't really know, you've never read a book, you can't add up 1 and 1 and 2. So, hang on, look at the credentials of Bernard. Again, made time today to speak to you guys. He was awarded the United States Meritorious Service Medal and, as I say, overqualified for today's rally. So welcome him on the stage, Mr. Bernard Gaynor.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. My friends, my fellow Australians, it is fantastic to be with you on the Gold Coast today with this sunny weather in the midst of all the rain. And thank you so much for coming in this wet, soggy week. Now, I'm honoured to stand with you today because you've all shown great courage to come. And it is fitting that we come today. This Easter weekend, we celebrate the greatest and most influential events in Western civilisation. This weekend signifies the importance of our values and where they come from. And this weekend is under attack by those who want to replace our heritage with Islam, or from those who deceitfully claim that Islam is as good as any other idea. It is not. So it is important today that we reject publicly, loudly and clearly any idea that Islam is equal to our Western Christian values. Islam does not protect women. It does not protect children. It does not protect families. And it does not allow individual freedom. Islam is not equal to our values. Islam is not peaceful, and it is not for Australia. Today, we stand together to say this. Today, we have come together to do something very, very important indeed. Today, we have come to reclaim Australia. And let's be honest, let's be brutally frank. Australia needs reclaiming. Our country has gone past the crossroads. It is already on the path to chaos, calamity and destruction. And there is one big reason for this: political correctness. It is working for our nation's enemies while targeting those who hold our values dear. So let's look at political correctness. Let's see how it works. This is important because if you want to stand in the front line of public debate and defend our freedom, you need to know the persecution that you will face. Now, what is the main objective of political correctness? It is silence. Its objective is to silence us. And it is doing this, and it will continue to do this unless we act. Australia used to be the country where you could call a spade a bloody shovel. Now it's the country where you can be fined just for talking about the elephant in the room. It is this political correctness that is bringing our nation to its knees. It is this political correctness that is eating away at our values, our beliefs, and our right to be proud of our heritage and traditions. It is this political correctness that is giving the enemies of this nation protection while targeting ordinary Australians. And the result of silence, the result of political correctness, is a society that has lost the will to defend itself. And that is exactly where Australia finds itself today until you people came out. Now let me give you an example of just how totalitarian this political correctness in Australia has become. Let me explain to you why it is brutally and painfully clear that we don't have freedom of speech in Australia anymore, a country that has a proud history of fighting for freedom. Just this week, I had to travel to Sydney to face allegations that I'd broken anti-free speech laws. I want to make this point. I've not been dragged before a tribunal because I defamed anyone. I've not been dragged before a tribunal because I infringed copyright. I have not been dragged before a tribunal because I said anything that was untruthful. No, I faced 3 $100,000 fines because one homosexual activist is offended by my views on morality and family. And yet this same activist has called for Australians to be more welcoming and accepting of Islam. It is suicidal lunacy. I faced 20 anti-free speech complaints from this same person. And in a country where the justice system supposedly prevents anyone from being put on trial for the same thing twice, this activist has admitted that the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Board has allowed him to lodge multiple duplicate complaints. It's already cost me over $20,000 to defend my right to express my beliefs. However, it costs the activist nothing to complain, and he will pocket any fine that is awarded by the Thought Police. This anti-free speech activist has stated publicly that he does not believe in free speech, but he does believe that he has the right to police other people's speech. My speech, your speech, anyone's speech. And he's also publicly stated that he wants to use anti-free speech laws to seize my house and to throw my wife and 6 children onto the streets. This is happening in a country that I went to war for. It is happening in the country that I served to protect. I was prepared to die to protect freedom in Australia. And now I'm being put on trial. I'm on trial by the Thought Police because they don't like my beliefs. It is an insult, not just to me, but to all those who have fought for this nation's freedom. Anti-discrimination laws are the source of this legal terrorism, and that is exactly what it is. They are nothing more than an attempt to intimidate ordinary Australians from speaking their minds and to protect those who hate our culture and our way of life. These laws targeted me because I dared to stand on the front line of public debates and open my mouth. And they can just as easily target you if you dare to do so as well. But I'll tell you what these laws don't care about. They don't care about the fact that the activist who complained against me has bandied my address around with Islamic organisations and incited them to take action to stop me from speaking. As a result of this man's actions, I'm not just facing huge fines, I'm also being forced to move my family to protect their safety. And I'll tell you what else these laws don't care about. The face of Hizb ut-Tahrir in Australia, Uthman Bada, was going to stand up in the Sydney Opera House last year and defend the Islamic concept of honour killings. No one from the Department of Thought Police had any problems with that gem of an idea. But fortunately, that speech did not go ahead. This was not due to anti-free speech laws, it was due to something much better, the absolute outrage expressed by ordinary Australians everywhere. Now, this situation shows 2 things very clearly. Firstly, anti-free speech laws don't do anything to stop real hate speech that actually does put lives in danger. And secondly, the majority of ordinary Australians have not yet been silenced. We can take action to protect our values, and we can still reclaim Australia. It is this tremendous spirit that has brought all of us together here today and across Australia to reclaim our freedom, reclaim our nation, and to reclaim Australia. And there is much to reclaim Australia from. So let's now talk in detail about the great threat that Australia faces and the way that this threat has been allowed to grow because political correctness has protected it and tries its very best to stop us talking about it. This threat is Islam. It should be pretty obvious that there is something inherently dangerous about Islam. Our military has been at war with Islamic groups that want to impose Islamic rule over the entire world since 2001. And anyone who has studied history will know that this war has been going on since Muhammad's day. It is a 1400-year-old war, and it is waged by the followers of a prophet who is actually a military warlord, a man who, in one example, had 700 Jews beheaded in a single day. This man Muslims believe to be perfect, and this man's example is what Muslims believe that they must follow. Now, I served in Iraq as an intelligence officer and also briefly in Afghanistan at war against groups that follow Muhammad's bloody example perfectly. I've got the medals to show for it too. So I've earned the right to speak about this threat, and I have the experience to speak about it with authority. And furthermore, I did not put my life on the line overseas to come home to be silenced by politically correct bullies and thugs who have no experience, no authority, and nothing but empty slogans of racism and bigotry. Unfortunately, I have suffered for speaking out about this threat, and I hate to say this, but the Australian Army, an organisation that I love, actually tried to charge me with military offences for writing on my webpage as a private citizen that those who hold the same beliefs as the Taliban should not be allowed to settle in Australia. Now, I beat those charges, but I eventually lost my commission as an officer because of my views. And this is craziness. It is akin to sacking an officer in World War II for opposing Japanese immigration. And I also hate to say this, but this is true and it must be said. One of the effects of not being able to say that you don't want people with the same beliefs as the Taliban to settle in Australia is that people with the same beliefs as the Taliban will settle in Australia. And that is exactly what is happening before our eyes. Australia's Islamic population has doubled since 2001, during the time we have been at war with violent Islamic militants. It is a recipe for disaster. And let's just recount some of the ways that this recipe is already a bloody disaster in this country. Muslims have gone on a violent rampage through the centre of Australia's largest city while publicly declaring their support for Osama bin Laden. That is a fact. There are more Muslims from Australia fighting with the Islamic State than in the Australian Defence Force. That is a fact. The Australian Islamic community has borne a war casualty rate over 20 times higher than the rest of this nation, but its sons have been dying for a group that we're at war with. That is a fact. The terrorism threat levels have gone up, and Australians have started dying in terrorist attacks at home. That is a fact. An AWOL Australian Army soldier blew himself up in Syria for the Islamic State. That is a fact. The report into the Link Cafe terror attack stated that there are at least 400 people deemed to be a higher threat than Manharan Monis in this country, and that there are thousands more just like him. That is a fact. Our Prime Minister has stated that there are at least 30 people who have fought with the Islamic State now back in Australia. That is a fact. Who knows? Maybe these returned veterans might even get their own Anzac Day march. Political correctness, you never know what's going to happen. The elected representatives of Australia's Islamic community, Grand Mufti Ibrahim Abu Muhammad, wrote to the Senate last year stating that laws outlawing the advocation of terrorism infringed his community's religious freedom. That is a fact. Hizb ut-Tahrir has called for an Islamic army in Australia with the mission of imposing Sharia law. That is a fact. And a report into Australia's counter-terrorism activity released by the Prime Minister in February stated that we are losing this war on every front. That is a fact. And yet, after all this, after 15 years of proof that the Islamic community has been unable to integrate, unable to assimilate, unable to prevent violence, and only too willing to fight for this nation's enemies, our current government has just announced that it wants to increase the cultural diversity of the Australian Defence Force. And that means one thing: a politically correct directive to specifically recruit Muslims into our nation's Defence Force. In fact, the Royal Australian Navy has already designed a uniform specifically for Muslims. And this comes after a Department of Defence report last year stated that the number of Anglo-Australian males in the military was undesirable, and that the focus on courage in the army was limiting integration of minorities into the military. You heard that right. Some politically correct academic numpty has written that the number of Anglo-Australian males in the military and their focus on courage is a problem. And the Department of Defence went and put its logo on the front page of that report and published it. It's craziness. And you should know that the very first plan announced by our current government to increase cultural diversity in the military is the appointment of an imam for the Australian Defence Force. Now, this idea was announced by Stuart Robert a few weeks ago. All of you should know who Stuart Robert is. He's the local federal member of Parliament on the Gold Coast. So I suggest that all of you go and pay Mr. Robert a visit and tell him in good Aussie fashion exactly what you think of his idea. Now, this is important. If you really want to reclaim Australia and protect it from the threat of Islam, you won't go home today and do nothing. you'll go and visit Mr Roberts from the electorate of Fadden on the northern Gold Coast and speak your minds. It's his job to listen to you guys. Now, Stuart Robert is also the Assistant Minister for Defence. That means he has a duty to ensure that the Australian Defence Force is not weakened, but is re-strengthened and able to take action in a war that this very government has recognised we are losing on every front. He is not doing that, and you must let him know. Of course, the biggest proof that political correctness is protecting Islam at the expense of the freedom of ordinary Australians comes from our supposedly conservative Prime Minister himself, Tony Abbott. Last year, Prime Minister Abbott announced that Australians would not get back the freedom of speech laws that they voted for. He announced that he would not repeal laws that punish ordinary Australians for offending minorities. Essentially, his reasoning for his backflip promise was because he didn't think now was the time to upset the Islamic community. Well, we're here today to tell our Prime Minister and all the other politicians that the time for offending and upsetting ordinary Australians is over. We are offended that the Prime Minister chose to keep laws curtailing our ability to speak. We are offended that he did this in order to please the Islamic community. The same Islamic community that claimed just a few weeks ago that Hizb ut-Tahrir should have the freedom to speak about armies imposing Islamic Sharia law in Australia. We are offended that the Prime Minister, the man who coined the phrase Team Australia, has effectively told us that Team Islam runs the show when it comes to what we can and can't say. We are offended that just this week the Prime Minister stated that Australians are happy with the imposition of halal certification over the food that we eat. We are not. And today we are reclaiming our freedom. We are reclaiming our freedom to speak our minds. And we say this loud and clear. The government must stop protecting, assisting, funding and promoting a community that has more of its sons of war against us than fighting for us. And woe betide any government that fails to listen to our message. Australians will be merciless at the ballot box. And we also send the government this message. Until today, we've been known as the silent majority. Not anymore. Today we are speaking up loud and clear. We are proud Australians. We are decent Australians. We are patriotic Australians. And we will celebrate that. And we'll also demand that it be recognised instead of derided. So let it be known, today is the day that the silent majority has found its voice and taken action to reclaim Australia. And now let me hear from you. Let me hear from you loud and clear. Are you patriotic Australians? Yeah. Do you want to be able to speak freely? Yeah. Do you say that anti-free speech laws must go? Yeah. And do you say that Islam must be confronted and defeated? Yeah. And do you say that it's time to reclaim Australia? Yeah. Thank you very much.